My guest today is a former New York Broadway columnist and radio host. At one time, he was a talent agent, and one of his clients was Bette Midler, among many other names. We're going to dig into that. Today, he's moderator and host of the 73-year-old Media Roundtable that's right here in Sarasota these days. Now, full disclosure, I've spoken and attended a number of their meetings, and I guess that might make me a member. I don't know. Originated in 1950 in New York City, the organization, Media Roundtable, has grown and evolved over the years. Dick Miller seems to know everyone in show business, but that's not all. Dick is the honorary official ambassador for Aruba. I'm going to ask him about that too. And in his spare time, if he has any, Dick and his wife, Deborah, sell real estate. Dick Miller, welcome to Suncoast People.
Thank you, Robert. Nice to be here.
Now, what haven't you done?
I don't know.
You mentioned earlier you had how many different jobs, how many different careers?
Well, I always tell people I did a dozen things. I had a dozen careers, and I started to add them up. I think there was 18 or 20, and I lost track.
Holy cow.
I don't know. It's like 2 lifetimes.
It is too. You've lived multiple lifetimes.
Yes.
And you're only 46. That's the amazing part of it. In your early career, you were a talent agent going
Yes.
back some years. And you were Bette Midler's first agent.
Yes, I was. She came to my office. She was a young 20-year-old, came from Hawaii, and she got off the plane and she read a couple of show business newspapers like Backstage Show Business or maybe Variety. She came to my office and she said, I want to be managed by you. And I said, well, I'm an agent, but let's talk. And she wouldn't sit down. And she's walking all over the office. And I said, would you have a seat? We'll talk about it. You knew from that moment that that girl was going to be a star. She knew it. I took her to Sardi's first. I said, Bette, I'm not the agent for you. And she said, oh, you don't like me. You don't like the way I sing. You don't like the way. I said, Bette, you want to get into records and nightclubs, and I'm on Broadway, films, television, and commercials. 2 different areas of show business. I don't know what to do with you, and I don't mean that in a bad way. She left. Years later, I saw her, and I went backstage, and she spent a half an hour after one of her concerts, and she said, you were right. I was right, and I helped her, and because I was right, telling her I was not her agent, get an agent that knows the area that you're going into, she became a big star.
And she sure did. And, when I think of Bette Midler, I certainly think of her as an actress. But first and foremost, that voice. She is a singer.
Yes, she is. And that's why, at that time, in fact, she asked me, I can say it now, we were at Sardi's that night after Fiddler on the Roof, the performance, and she said, what did you think of me? And I looked at her and I said, you want the honest truth? She said, of course. I said, I think you were awful. You're wrong for the role. And
she's a great talent. It was the wrong vehicle for her.
Well, it was the wrong vehicle. She's this modern, kooky, crazy kid.
Yeah.
And she's playing in the turn-of-the-century European Fiddler on the Roof. She said, I agree, but don't tell Hal. Hal Prince?
Sure.
The director and producer.
Sure.
And so I said, no, I would never do that. Of course not.
Wow.
But
and the rest is history.
Right.
What drew you to show business in the first place?
Great question. And here's the answer.
It's going to be a great answer, I'm sure.
Thank you. When I was 10 years old, my mother took me to the Paper Mill Playhouse in Milburn, New Jersey, and I saw Showboat. Since then, till today, it's one of my favorite, probably my favorite, because it's my first love. Show business and Showboat. And I just fell in love with the theater. I wasn't going to be an actor.
So you knew that you wanted to be involved in show business
Yes.
with the theater, but you didn't want to be an actor.
Right.
What other roles were there that you knew of at the time or that you learned about that you thought, wow, this is something I can do?
Well, when I was 12, I met Fred Fail. He was a celebrity photographer for Broadway and celebrities. He was in New York, but he was at the paper mill, and I had gone up there with my little Brownie box camera.
Oh, sure.
And I was taking pictures. I had a fascination for pictures, taking photos. And so he saw me in the back of the theater, and he called me up on stage while he was taking photos. Not during a performance, of course.
Right.
They were just doing a photo shoot.
Right.
And he said, young man, come over here. I'll show you how to hold the camera. I never forgot this. And he said, you keep it lower, see, and this is how you do it. He gave me a 5-minute kind of lesson, and I started.
There was a master's course in 5 minutes.
Yes, and I took pictures after that. I became 15 at one point, and I went and to ask the concessionaire if I could work there, and he said sure. So I ended up working there, and then I started to take pictures inside the theater doing performances. Anybody who knows Actors Equity Associations, that's a no-no.
Right.
And it was an Actors Equity theater, but nobody complained because the actors knew I had developed the film, that's old, and I would go backstage and I had a little catalog, and I numbered each photo, and the actors would buy them from me. 25, 35, 50 cents, and an 8x10 was 75 cents.
Whoa.
And so I became popular with the theater people. So someone from Van Horn and Son from Philadelphia.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, they were a very well-known costume company.
Yeah.
They made costumes for shows, Broadway shows. And the president came up to the paper mill, and he said, young man, would you like to take some pictures of the show, because there are costumes, and we'll use them in our magazine, and we'll give you credit. No money, but credit.
Okay.
Then my boss said, well, we can use them in the souvenir program. We'll give you credit, no money, but I loved it. That was an opportunity. So I eventually became a photographer for Broadway shows. And I don't mean Broadway shows where you take pictures and they publish them in ads or whatever, but they would have parties, celebrity parties, and they'd have promotional stunts or things that the press agents would arrange.
Sure.
And they would call me up. They'd say, kid, how much do you charge? $10, $20, whatever.
Yeah.
Just to eat in those days.
Sure.
And I worked at Broadway shows and doing what I knew best, selling Broadway souvenir programs, candy, and cold drinks, where I met producers. And then it started to evolve. The producer of Bye Bye Birdie was a stage manager first at the Winter Garden Theater, and he came to me, Ed Padula, and he said to me, hey kid, do you have any friends who can act and dance and sing? So I sent a girlfriend of mine there. She didn't get the show. But anyway, I got to know Ed Padula. And so it evolved, and people started to get to know me. And eventually I went from taking pictures to opening up my own office on Broadway. Broadway and 46th Street at the Victoria Theater building, where so many producers and writers and directors had offices. And I had my first office there. I represented children and teenagers for Broadway shows. And one year I had 47 children out of 53 on Broadway.
Holy cow.
And that was amazing. And I wasn't even an agent, I was a manager.
Okay.
So one day I get a call from Vinny Donahue from Actors Equity, and he said, hey Dick, how you doing? And I said, fine, Vinny. He said, listen, I want to offer you ought to be an agent. Now, for the people watching right now, they'll probably say, well, management agent, what's the difference?
What is the difference? I was about to ask you that.
Right, so I'm filling in the blanks here.
Thank you.
So yes, so a manager manages a career. So you could take someone and you could say, I'll get you a job. I might need an agent to help procure that job.
Right.
However, I will also do some publicity about you. I'll do other things for you to develop your career. Now, an agent is a booking agent. And an agent books jobs. But of course, I couldn't help myself. So I helped people in their careers as well. I was a managing agent, let's call it. So Vinny said, so I said, well, you're supposed to have 2 years experience working for another agency. And he said, we'll waive that. But there's one requirement. You have to have 6 letters from Actors Equity members recommending you as sort of an upstanding citizen or whatever.
Sure.
So I went to 6 stars, and I said, because I knew them, I was a kid, I met all these people. So I went to 6 stars from Broadway, and I said, could you do me a favor and write a letter and say you knew me for all these years? And they said, of course.
Name drop.
Well, I knew you were going to say that, and it's been so long. Anita Gillette is one person.
Oh, sure.
Now,
She's
she starred
wonderful.
in 7 Broadway shows at that time, within 5 years. But I know she's not the major star that people think about.
She was a big Broadway
but she
star.
was a big Broadway star.
I remember also she would do guest appearances on those panel shows in the day, the What's My Lines, and To Tell the Truths, and those kinds of shows that a lot of Broadway. I want to talk about you getting into radio, because you had your own radio show.
Another great question.
Coast to Coast.
You won't believe it.
And I read about how you started that radio show, and it's a bit of an inspiration. So tell that story. How did you start your radio show?
Robert, I want to digress for a second. You did your homework. I am so impressed. People watching, they'll think, oh, he wrote down these questions.
Listen, I even have a copy of that jaywalking ticket from walking across 6th Avenue between 51st and 52nd in 1972. I have that ticket right. I'm teasing you. I'm teasing you.
I know you, because I never got I never got a jaywalking ticket for jaywalking. But anyway, so the question was, how did I start my radio show? I was dating a young girl named Deborah Walker. And she was an actress. And she and I met, and soon afterwards, we lived together in our apartment in New York. She was starring in young leads like the ingenues. After she starred in these Broadway shows, she took some cruises that she was the leading lady in various shows that they did. And one day, because it was $5 a minute to call her, and I couldn't afford $5 a minute, maybe a minute or two, but I wasn't going to call her for a long time. So she was on the ship, and I took a cassette, and I put it in the cassette player, and I hit record. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dick Miller, New York, New York. And I'm doing this special broadcast from my apartment in New York for my girlfriend, Deborah Walker. Well, everybody on the ship, in her group, the entertainers, they would look forward to my weekly show. And it was basically a love letter to her. It wasn't. Absolutely, it was a love letter to her, and she couldn't believe it. Well, so when I started my real show on a New York station, a small FM station, I brokered the time, and so I started to ask all these celebrities. And of course, it was easy, and people would say, it's so interesting, you were asking all these questions, and you're fascinating, and where did you learn to be on the radio? And I would say, I listened to it. Well, they wouldn't. Yes, I did. I listened to radio, I have to say, in the 40s and 50s. And I really became expert in interviewing people because I remembered how they did it. You learned from the best, too, that way. I did. And I really emulated exactly what I heard.
Who was your radio presenter or interviewer inspiration? Who did you go, wow, this person is the best of the best?
You know, it's hard to, I can't. I'm laughing in one way because he wasn't, but he did interview thousands of people. Joe Franklin.
Oh, good Lord, Joe Franklin.
He was a character.
Anybody from the New York area would know who Joe Franklin was.
Joe was a character, and I had been on his radio and television show many times.
And you worked in print, you had a column, and you worked in print and you worked in broadcast. Which do you prefer?
I love them both, and I want to tell you something. The way I started my column is interesting because I was a talent agent. I wanted to do something else. So I thought, I know show business, so why don't I write a newsletter for my people on the service? That'll be unique. So I wrote a newsletter like a column. In those days, we didn't have software or whatever, but I made it look like a column. Now, I looked into it, and I was told King Features owned all the newspaper columns in the country. And unless you were with King Features, you couldn't write a column. Well, it's not the Dick Miller way. I don't work for anybody. I do it myself.
Right.
So how could I do that? I wrote a letter to every paper in the country.
Seriously? And this was before the days of email and send, where you could send 100.
Yep.
This was one at a time you were writing this.
I wrote a letter to everybody, and I said, I write a column. Of course, I was writing a newsletter, right? But I knew that I could go to a typesetter who could set the column and make it look like one. I'll put my picture on top, and I'll call it Dick Miller, New York, New York. And it's all about nightlife and Broadway. So I started to get answers from the newspapers. They called me up, and they would pay me $2 a week for a column.
Each paper?
Each paper.
$2, okay.
Well, you do the math. I had dozens and dozens.
Sure.
I had so much fun syndicating the column. And I was in the San Francisco Chronicle. I was in dozens of weekly newspapers.
We need to take a quick break.
Okay.
And when we come back, we're going to fast forward even more. There's so much to talk about. I would love to have you on again to help fill in some of these blanks. Well, you've got a deal there. But in the meantime, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back with Dick Miller, we're going to talk about some of the things that he's up to today. We'll be right back. Thank you for watching and supporting Suncoast People. And if you like what we're doing, please make sure to follow and subscribe. If you're feeling generous, consider supporting Suncoast People through patreon.com/Suncoast People. And my conversation with Dick Miller continues. And this is a guy who says that he's had upwards of 20 careers. But we're going to fast forward to Sarasota. And Dick, you and Deborah, your wife, and was that the same Deborah who was the singer?
Same Deborah.
Same gal?
Yeah, we met in 1979, and we're going on 45 years.
Holy cow, good for you. You came to Sarasota when?
In 2004.
Why Sarasota?
That's what I said. Well, it's true. I was on the radio in New Jersey, and it was spilled over I was on 12 radio stations, syndicated, so it went to 5 states.
Okay.
And it was.
But you were on in the tri-state area.
Right. And it went to New York and Pennsylvania, wherever. And at one point, I decided I'm going to end that show. So Deborah saw an opportunity to change where we lived. She had bronchitis, and when you talk to someone who has bronchitis, It's not they always, it lies dormant.
Yes.
And every year they're dry coughing, and the cold and the dampness and everything is really bad for them. She said, why don't we go to Florida? Florida, people go there to die.
Right, it's God's waiting room.
I mean, come on. I mean, we're 40 minutes from Broadway.
Yeah.
I can't leave New York. She said, well, I just thought maybe because of my health, you know, and I thought it would be better for me. And I thought, well, we'll see. And we came to Florida. One thing led to another. We bought a piece of land. We ended up building a house. And the rest is history. We moved here.
Tell me about the Aruba connection. And I see you're wearing an Aruba pin.
Yes. Well, we'll go back to 1986. In 1986, I went on the radio in St. Martin. It's a Dutch island. The people
Lovely
from
place.
Aruba heard about me because they frequently went to St. Martin. When I went to Aruba 2 years later in 1988, one of the lady who was in charge of the media relations for the government saw me in the media lounge, and she said, "You're Dick Miller, and we want you to come to Aruba." And I said, "I'm in St. Martin." She said, "We need you. We just went independent from Holland, and we need you to be in Aruba." I said, well, you know, I'm really not in St. Martin either. I'm in New York. I live in New York.
Right.
So I record all the shows. Maybe I can record the Aruba shows. Both shows were unique, but they were geared for tourists, and all the locals listened.
Sure.
Because it was unique, and it was all about their island. It was, you know, a magazine type format, and to fill in a little between, I played a little music. I was not a DJ, but I made sure that I had a little entertainment, because nobody goes on vacation or even lives in Aruba or St. Martin who wants to listen to talk for an hour.
How did you become the ambassador?
Okay, so in 1989, I started the show in Aruba. It went on for 18 years.
Wow.
It's a long run. People were fascinated by having an American know so much about their local island.
I'm going to pause just for a second. How's that rain? Are we hearing the rain?
Oh, yes.
We are hearing the rain, Dick, and for the folks who are watching, we're going to roll right on through because we're indoors. So if you hear the thunder and the rain pounding, I'm dry. Are you dry?
Yes, I am.
How dry I am.
That shows how old we are.
Let's get back. Speak for yourself. Let's get back to Aruba, where the sun always shines. It's not rainy like Florida can be.
Well, at any opportunity, I told people about Aruba. I lived in the United States, but every 4 weeks came to Aruba. So I would talk to travel agents. I started to go to travel shows, and I became a speaker. The Aruba government, 13 ministers, the Minister of Tourism, the Minister of Education, 13,
a lot of ministers for such a tiny country.
Right. And they were 13 ministers, let's call them like senators. Somebody they proposed that Dick Miller should be an ambassador to our island, or for our island. And someone said, well, you know, you need 13 votes. If it's not unanimous, it won't work. So they created, successfully, with 13 positive votes, that Dick Miller is the first ambassador of goodwill for the island government of Aruba.
Well, Dick, I got to say, despite the rain that is coming down like crazy here, just outside the studio, this has been, well, you're just a ray of sunshine. That's all I can say. It's been great fun. Thank you, and I know you've got a lot more stories to tell.
Always.
We'll have you on a dry day.
Okay.
All right? And I want to thank you for sticking with us through this rainstorm. Holy cow. I hope that your gardens are green, and I want to thank you for your support. info@suncoastpeople.com is where to write. But in the meantime, I'm Robert Tibb, and thanks for watching.